Good morning. As Ken mentioned, we are the last panel before lunch, so we stand between you and your satisfying your appetite, right? So we'll try to make this quick, and we'll try to keep us on pace here. I do want to start off with just a quick audience exercise, if we could. And the purpose of this exercise I'll explain later. But first off, if you are a local agency, state agency, local municipality, or representative thereof, or an owner of large capital projects, could you please raise your hand? Great. Okay, now if you are a representative of an engineering firm, a consulting firm of some sort, a design firm, or other serving those types of agencies, could you please raise your hand? Fantastic. Wow, there's a lot. Lastly, if you are a supplier, a vendor, contractor, could you please raise your hand? Wow, it's pretty well split here. And the purpose really was to kind of pull out some of the themes that I think some of the other panelists have mentioned, which goes to collaboration and partnerships amongst us in the industry to make the projects that we're trying to deliver on successful, right? So please, as we get through the lunch time frame here, network, use that time effectively, get to know each other. The relationships that we start building today are going to be the ones that help us deliver these projects in the future, and there's a lot of projects to deliver. Okay, so my name is John Tuskowski. I'm a senior director at Kahua. I'm a senior director of strategic partners. Kahua is an industry-leading collaborative project management information solution, and we help owners, contractors, agencies alike face some of the most complex challenges and deliver some of the most complex projects in the industry. At Kahua, my role is to work with some of our strategic partners that are on the front lines of helping owners, agencies, contractors, suppliers, vendors deliver these complex programs. And I'm proud to have two of those partners on the panel today with me. To my left is Thomas Everett, a director from Campos Sage. Thomas is a PMP certified professional with a master's in computer information systems. He brings over 17 years of experience in IT transformation, helping clients maximize the use of technology to better manage their projects. He's led over 100 projects, totaling over $40 billion in investment from government, education, transportation, and the hospitality sectors. And along with his 20 years of experience serving in the U.S. Army as an information technology manager and company commander, Thomas brings a wealth of experience in understanding people, processes, and the technology that is needed to deliver these complex projects. Campos Sage's mission is to help owners maximize their infrastructure and portfolios and remove silos between facilities, construction, and operations by providing an industry-driven and structured approach to transformation. To his left, Stephen Hamilton, Senior Manager in Deloitte's Infrastructure and Capital Projects practice, where he focuses on strategic and financial advisory services for major public and private clients seeking to deliver the next generation of infrastructure and support sustainable, resilient, and inclusive economic growth. With more than 17 years of experience providing market, strategic planning, and transaction support for large-scale infrastructure and economic development projects worldwide, Stephen's portfolio includes transit, water, ports, airports across 20 countries, and working for multilateral development banks, public, and leading commercial clients. Steve is currently engaged in the Cascadia Corridor project as a strategic planning advisor. At Deloitte, the infrastructure and capital project practice focuses on integrated solutions across the entire asset lifecycle, from planning to delivering and operating some of the world's most critical infrastructure projects. So today's panel, as Ken mentioned, was titled A Journey to Elevated Efficiency and Collaboration in Complex Transportation Projects. And at first I thought, well, doesn't that really sound very idealistic and utopian, right? We're all trying to get to that end state. And a journey itself kind of suggests a few things. It suggests A, a starting point, and B, a destination. Now, we all know that how you get from A to B can be a various road or twists and turns and roadblocks, if you will. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what that journey can look like. And as we can all attest to, we know from listening to some of the panelists today that delivering some of these projects is a journey. Some of those projects that I think Sound Transit mentioned were in 2044, 2047. So we've got a long way to go before some of these projects come to realization. And I would say that some of the panelists also mentioned a lot of the challenges that we're currently facing. Increased complexity on delivery, funding and financing of these projects, not to mention, inflation costs and logistical challenges of getting things to a site. So with all of these challenges, how do we try to navigate this maze, and what does that look like? So the first question, we're going to set the stage here. The bigger the project, the more stakeholders are involved. So Thomas, in our preparation for this session, you mentioned it's hard enough to get the business together to make decisions, let alone all the stakeholders at the table. But now there's different stakeholders that are getting involved, and the table is getting larger. So could you expand a little bit on some of the stakeholders you're seeing brought forth and the agendas that are being brought forth as these complex projects become larger?
Thanks, John. I'm going to start with the usual suspects. And I've got a question for you, another one of these hand-raising drills. So if you consider yourself in the construction or engineering, would you raise your hand? Oh, good. All right, how about design professionals, specifically architects? Do we have any architects? Okay. Guys, we got to talk to the architects. I know it's difficult. They think differently than us, but we've got to talk to the architects. Same thing, the legal guys. If you want to legal and finance, what'll happen a lot of times is that another stakeholder, you bring a risk manager in, especially with a bigger project, and you get the same group of people around the table. You get the construction guys and maybe the architect, the engineers. And if you really want to get into risk, invite in the financial guy, invite in the lawyers. You want to see the risk. I was reading a book recently, and one of the things it brought up, it said, is it a zero risk or is it a low risk? Because those low risk things are really bite you in the buns later. And that's why you need to have all these people at the table. You need to have not only the likely suspects, the usual ones, but you need to invite in organizational change management. You need to invite in diversity and inclusion. You need to invite in the lawyers, the finance, the community outreach. All of these players come in, and as they do, guess what? It adds even more complexity. You think, well, it's just one more person at the table. How bad can that be? Well, the table gets full in a hurry. But then you have to wade through all the conversation that they're bringing in. You have to still control that situation and keep things on pace in sidebar conversations so that you can have meetings with them later. But what you can't do, the worst thing I've ever seen in my entire life with a communication was, oh, that's stupid. Once you throw that out, everybody shuts down. You have to continue to include people in the conversation, bring them in. It is difficult. I'm not saying it's easy, but you got to pull everybody in, get their feedback, and keep things on pace moving forward. With my PMP hat on for just a moment, you're always thinking about scope, cost, and time. But what I've discovered is you've really got to learn the soft skills. You've got to learn processing people and working with other folks to be able to accomplish what you're doing. So there's the number of stakeholders has truly increased.
Thank you. And Stephen, you're involved in probably one of the largest and most complex programs in the region as well here that involves multiple states, Canadian provinces, impacts tribal and indigenous nations as well. Could you tell us a little bit about the issues surrounding that project and program and maybe how you're getting stakeholders involved early?
Sure, and no one's going to raise their hands. Sorry for that. We're going to wait on that. Yeah, and thanks first and foremost for having us. Really appreciate it, being with you, John and Thomas. Yeah, so Deloitte was really thrilled and honored last October to be selected by Washington State Department of Transportation to serve as strategic program advisor for the envisioned Cascadia high-speed rail system. If you haven't heard about it, it seeks to link in 1 hour point-to-point up to 250 mile per hour journey times, Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver. So in terms of thinking of data sharing, governance, shared strategic value, financial models, compliance with ESG standards that are evolving in real time at the federal level here, there's perhaps no more complex series of decisions around advancing this to some state of a kind of project decision by the jurisdictional partners in Washington, Oregon, and BC. So we've been at the table since October, working very closely in lockstep with Washington State Department of Transportation, looking at the overall business case around this, looking at the regional competitiveness case around this, looking at adjacent modes that are also going to evolve and change over time, everything from an I-5 master plan. And then we've also helped think about federal funding requirements as supported under IJA and IRA, working closely with the jurisdictional partners around submissions for the federal-state partnership for any city rail, which was vastly expanded, allowing for planning dollars under IJA, and then the corridor identification and development program. But to piggyback on your point, it's 2 federal governments, it's 2 states, and it's a province. So the layers of jurisdictional complexity are immense, but that's why it's absolutely critical to have a shared understanding and value. What does the system seek to do up front? How do these partners seek to work together? What's the governance model? How does it transform and move over time? What are competing issues around mobility, transportation? We're probably, it'd be decade to 15 years out from a shovel ever hitting the ground on this. But all the steps we make now, and that we're been so fortunate to be able to advise upon thus far, working with these partners, will matter. And also, as a final point, think about the communities along the way, along the rights of way. And you mentioned tribal and indigenous. There's literally millions of people that this would impact. And we in infrastructure have not historically been great about talking about the value of infrastructure, and certainly not communicating or making sure the benefits reach those communities who've been left behind. There's also a huge issue around how do we communicate about this and make it real? How does a program that really won't see its full operational kind of go for a moment 20 to 25 years from now, how do we keep it real and create the right standards that are flexible enough that allow for good program governance and evolution over time?
So maybe to expand on that a little bit, Stephen, how do we start to get our hands around these different complexities, these different agendas that everyone is going to bring to the table, the needs that all these stakeholders are going to have? What needs to be considered at a foundational level as you kind of start thinking about these types of programs and projects?
Yeah, I think when we're at the very front end of this, so we're really kind of strategic planning phase, and you'd be thinking subject to federal support, ongoing support from the legislature, the political alignment across these jurisdictions. You'd be looking about advancing to some sort of decision around environmental process, let's say in 3 to 4 years. But that's technical and advisory work, right? So the business case, the strategic plan, the evolution of the governance, the legal regulatory structures that would allow this project to evolve. I think the business case is now fundamentally different. I think we're thinking about disinvested communities, thinking about the new sustainability requirements, thinking about benefits tracking around Justice 40. I think in the impetus behind this to include communities and others who've, again, historically been marginalized or left behind across a 400-mile corridor. So you need shared standards, I think, around public engagement, We've been doing a lot of deep dives and listening, looking at mega programs globally, but also looking at the MPOs who've done really successful public engagement. For example, Oregon Metro in the Rose Corridor has done some really innovative things. We're looking at that. So part of this is not looking to reinvent the wheel, but use local capacity and build upon it, being fully cognizant that a program like this, can be, certainly it's driven by the jurisdictional partners to start, the departments of transportation, MPOs, and others. But the only way this will ever work is if you have true alignment and concurrence over decades. Mm-hmm. And so that's the kind of the challenge before us, is getting a shared understanding of the impact, what it means to these communities, ultimately things like community benefits agreements as stakeholder engagement gets underway. But we're just at the beginning of this and really waiting, guided obviously by our clients here.
And John, the other thing I'm thinking about is it takes a long time on these large projects to get things moving, and then you get moving along. So the whole thing could take 10, 15 years. In some people's minds, you put this plan and off you go with it. Well, that's just not the way it works. I had an old boss that said, you don't need to get stuck on stupid. I had a plan to start with, and I'm going to execute it regardless. Well, you need to have gates where you're taking and pulling those off. Look back at those key success factors when you first got started and go, is this still relevant? Does this still work? If it doesn't, you need to change the plan. You need to have processes in place, the technology that'll support it, that you can continue to change as things continue to change on you. We were sitting last year, maybe I was a little bit late to the game, but ESG, I'd never heard this term before. So the environmental social governance. It's the first time I'd heard it, and it came from the community in a request for proposal. It's like, what are you doing to support this? And that's how you get your voice and how we start building these systems, is people raise their hand and say, hey, what are you doing about this? And then we got to thinking about it. It says, well, how am I going to support the sustainability with the environment? What could I do with that? And that's what we're building through Kahua, an asset module. So as you're doing asset management, you start at the very beginning of the project through the planning all the way through execution. And why don't you pick up the sustainability with that as you go? One of the people brought up in the room, hey, do you know we're having to try to figure out what the carbon footprint of a water fountain in a public school is? So these things, if you have to figure it out after the fact, it's the same thing in a construction project where all this documentation is being gathered along the way, but nobody's really categorizing it, put it together so it's a good handoff to facilities management or to any of the maintenance and operations. You start that planning process early, and you capture that information from the very beginning. Your suppliers, are they sustainable? All of this is being started to be categorized and cataloged, and that's what we need to take advantage of it.
So a couple things there to just dive into or lean in on a little bit. A couple themes I got, maybe, alignment, setting the alignment and expectations up front, but being flexible in how that is carried out over the long-term execution of the program or project. Also, kind of thinking with the end in mind, Thomas, to what you just said. So starting a little bit with what are the things that we don't know now, potentially, that we're going to want to know later on down the road. It's a little bit of the unknown. And so how do you address maybe thinking about some of those unknown factors that you don't know what you don't know going into something, 5, 10, 15 years from now? How do you start thinking about those at the outset and addressing the possibility that something might come up that you weren't aware of?
I think I think the folks here will have seen it locally. There's been a lot of discussion around a potential airport siting, for example. So think about modal choice, capacity around a high-speed rail network, the master planning around I-5. What's the Washington legislature supporting? And then you think about the potential for expanded air capacity across the region. In and of themselves, those are all tremendously difficult challenges. So then you think about the opportunity to bring them together. What are the trade-offs around articulating this vision that's focused on sustainable long-term growth in a region that needs to absorb potentially 1.5 million people in the existing footprint of the region based on some of the growth plans over the next decade or two. And there's tons of questions, John, to your point around, okay, what about autonomous vehicle movements? Like, how does that impact the need for these systems, right? What about the evolving landscape in air flight? What about unused air capacity around the greater Seattle, area? I think I kind of feel like we're constantly dealing in the world of unknowns just around these big challenges, and then you get to the minutia nitty gritty. Like just one example: funding flows across the border to support project development, aligning planning standards across the United States and Canada. There's different models. There's different ways in which governance works, even with the legislative processes in the two countries. You start getting into border controls and security exchanges. You potentially need the U.S. Senate following a presidential authorization to create a new port of entry. So, and then all the while, you're hemming to hopefully a North Star vision around what this project means. So this is happening in parallel. So I think it's a bold, audacious, classically kind of Pacific Northwest challenge, right? But to the moment, something that everyone here and many folks in this room will be impacted by or consider.
I want to shift a little bit to providing all these stakeholders with access to data and timely information. Because I think in a lot of cases, we see that the access to that data or timely information can actually, be a downfall of moving the project forward or executing further along on the project. I think we heard from one panelist today that mentioned, I think it was Ryan, that mentioned, they were waiting for forms to be signed from another jurisdiction so that they could move forward with their next step in their process. So how do we think about data, the sharing of data, the sharing of knowledge, consolidation of data across these stakeholders and allowing access to those that need to know so that they can make informed decisions?
So one of the first efforts is digitizing. That's what the one thing at the very beginning that, so what are these mega projects? What are you talking about? So typically billions of dollars worth of assets being put into place. But what's always amazing to me, and if you're in this category, I'm saying this so you don't feel alone, I still see people to this day, organizations managing that in Excel spreadsheets. We have some on 30-year-old systems that are trying to get off, that are running the risk of their systems failing. And then you have some of that group of continuous improvement. But along that way, get back to that digitizing and improving the process. One of the things that I was asking, so could you give me some examples of your reports? And says, well, this is the green sheet and this is the pink sheet. I'm like, what are you talking about? And it says, well, the green sheet activates a project, gets it going. It's your project approval. And if there's a change, then we use the pink sheet. That way we can tell where things are. So the way that you're tracking these systems is looking around for where are the green sheets and pink sheets. I've heard a different version of this story with blue sheets. I'm like, why are they blue? And it says, well, they always wind up on Fred's desk and we can't find the things. So if they're blue, it's easy to find them and we can move them forward. So the first thing we've got to do is to move these things into a system so that we can easily track them. The other movement that we've seen, and this is almost like when the conversation first got started about, are you in the cloud? Well, now it's the data, a data store, data warehouse, data lake. But the bottom line is putting it into a situation where the data is available to the people. You still put the security around it, but you take and put it into a way that you can digest it and serve it to the people for what they need. We talked about community involvement a little bit earlier. They want to know, where is my money going? When is it going to affect me? When are you going to be rolling an enormous crane down the road so that I can't get the kids to school? There's all these things that are going on that if you take that data, some people just need to know, where are we on the change management right now? Where are we on getting my request for information? Where's the supply? So there are different needs for different people. And then the last one I put together is that I'm kind of segregating that. You put it all together and you're keeping it in little silos, if you will, based upon your job role or what your involvement, your stakeholder position is in the project. But I think we sell ourselves short too, because the other thing that we can't lose sight of is what impact is what I'm doing having on somebody else, is making sure that you're keeping everything connected, understand the big picture and how it's affecting others.
Steve, anything to add to that?
I think to your point, I mean, Thomas, like if you think, I'm just thinking, obviously I'm kind of we're at the very front end of this program. My colleagues at Deloitte, US and Canada, and working with these partners. But it's probably not unfair to say that you are looking at probably one of the largest systems integration challenges one could envision. I mean, thinking about data transfers, again, across 2 states, a province, 2 countries with different data standards, different requirements. So what ultimately becomes, like, to your point, Thomas, what becomes that shared, whether it's a cloud-based environment, what's that shared data lake place where this information goes? Who has access to it? How do people use it? How does it intersect with your program management systems over time? What's the interoperability of your programs over time, especially when you have different consultants, architects, engineers, constructors, environmental specialists? What does that become that makes this thing possible? And I think it's a great point that you make, that not through purposeful effort or not through the lack of attention, sometimes systems have a way of becoming the pink, blue, red kind of slip sheet. And I think here it's a critical point to think, just as we're thinking about the North Star and why this is worth doing, and is it worth the environmental and economic and other aspects, how do you make sure that the program management function built out around this works as well for the partners involved within their own requirements?
And here's my one caution. You see all the audit, right now AI is big in the news. And it's like you even go, the first thing that they go by decide, hey, this is a wonderful thing that was going to help us out. Then you see the gloom and the doom with the Terminator and that kind of stuff. I'm a little bit concerned about that, but what I'm more concerned about is the same conversations that we were having with the workforce. It was the, power down but don't power off. You don't just give a task to somebody and forget it, be done with it. Same sort of thing is we just can't give the task to the computers and say good luck. We still have to be involved. Do not take the humans out of this.
That's a good point. As we kind of move to closing here, let's think about maybe some of the risks of not getting this right, not getting collaboration right, not getting coordination, communication across stakeholders, not setting those expectations up front, and not being able to adjust and pivot midstream. What are the risks here associated with not getting this right? And I'm sure there's a ton, right, that you can probably think of. One, maybe funding, projects not being completed on time, on budget, but what are some of the major risks here?
Maybe dueling banjos here. I'll give one, you give one, some bullet comments.
You're probably a better banjo player than I am, but
well, the first one would be is that you won't be the project manager anymore. You're going to be the change manager.
Boy, it's almost too much to apply that lens to kind of the work we're doing now, because but I do think in other projects, I just think the requirements around the federal funding in particular, the evolving standards out of the IJA, IRA, Justice 40, Washington, Hill, I think how those things get measured and quantified is not just a question of financial performance and risk to your organization, like could the feds claw the money back, possibly, but I also think it's just a transparency and credibility issue with your communities, right? So getting those data and those metrics right, and then showing the impact of these dollars on infrastructure programs, and making agreements that communicate true value, community benefits, great value, that matters a lot. And that's a question of credibility and trust. So if you don't have that, everything else can be going swimmingly, and I still think your projects at this planning phase and other things I've worked on, our teams have worked on, is really challenged from the start and won't advance, to be honest with you.
I can think of, I've worked a fair amount in New York, and I can think of 2 large programs that the programs overall succeeded, but they had pieces of it that failed, and typically it had to do with the community. They weren't involved, didn't know what was going on. I didn't realize it was going to cost that much, and then in the end of the day, what would have been great for the community in the long run, because the lack of understanding and taking that into account actually caused those pieces of the program to fail.
So it's not just about surfacing the data internally within the project teams or within the organizations to ensure success. It's also about surfacing that data externally for the community to understand more about those programs and projects, so they can build that trust and credibility that we're being good stalwarts of the funding that we're given to execute on those programs. Let me go back just to the data aspect. as we kind of think through that, we talked about data lakes, access to data warehouses, data storage. When you've got multiple jurisdictions involved, how does it get decided who owns what? Where does it all go? And how do you make sure that everyone has what they need?
I think Thomas gets that one. Yeah.
Well, again, that's a tough one because I've got to say it usually starts from the top down as far as the rules and regulations that are put in place. That's the first place I saw multi-factor authentication being required and single sign-on. It came out of that community. It came from a top down. Same things are coming through right now from other security aspects from the federal government, from the U.S. federal government. And then I have a bit of my experiences in emergency management, and I can tell you all things are from bottom up. It's always a local emergency, so it's not an easy answer to that. I think, again, it's one of these where you have to get all the parties at the table.
No, I think, and also I think you were alluding to this, I think just also not only a question of who gets and uses the data, but how it's protected. I mean, just, we're well aware, pipelines being taken over, infrastructure being shut down. Can you imagine the data breach and some of these things and the level of scale of harm? And I think the cyber issues around this are intrinsic. And I think, again, through no fault of our own, our aggressors and the people outside who want to do us harm are fast. It's non-nation state actors. So how do we protect not just our current infrastructure, but our future infrastructure when literally our regional livelihoods and the well-being of our economies depend on it? I think that's kind of a fundamental question.
Yeah. Open access to data sounds great, but security is also of extreme importance as we look to surfacing that data.
Yeah, a short piece of that. So working with Kahua, that's what one of the things, because we were all, I've been on the owner side myself, and that's what you're wanting access to your data. I know you've got my system, but I want the data. And that's what they've done was quite intelligent, was make a quick copy of it. So it's almost instantaneous. It takes a couple of minutes to happen, and the data store is protected. Then you have that on the inside. So the transactional data that's actually going on all the time is still kept behind the firewall, protected. But then you've got, again, through another layer of security, a data store that you can get your hands on. It is protected. If something was to happen to it, you still have all the other data still being secured, backed up, taken care of. And that's probably the same type of stuff where you take and get that information to yet another place so you're getting it to a location that it can be used closest to where the reporting is going on. And that's what you protected along the way with these firewalls that are in, these gates that are in between.
Fantastic. Well, as we can kind of think through some of these projects that aren't going to be shovel ready for decades potentially, right? The journey is going to take a while. It's not an easy journey. Understanding what's at stake here means we've got to get this right, but we don't have to get it right at the outset. We've got to be able to pivot. We've got to be able to change and adapt as we go down this journey. As there's going to be a lot of twists and turns and curves to get to that end point and that utopian, idealistic view of collaboration and working together. But anyway, with that, I want to thank our panelists today. And if anyone wishes to continue this discussion outside or during lunch, feel free to seek us out. Thank you all.
Thanks very much.